Good morning. Bye-bye.
Good morning. Okay, good morning, Chevra. Why don't we get started? I mentioned to you last week that what we would try to do today is do a bit of a review using the sefer called Hashavas Aveda Kahalacha, which is written by a rabbi in Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Yecheskel Feinhandler. This apparently has gone through a number of editions, and it includes not only the psak of the Shulchan Aruch and the Rav Shulchan Aruch, but also the Piskei Halacha of contemporary poskim as well. And he writes in the Sharblat, in the opening page, includes the Piskei Halacha of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Rav Moshe Feinstein, and Rav Elyashiv. And this edition that we're working with, it was when Rav Elyashiv was still alive, which is about, and I'm trying to remember how many years ago Rav Elyashiv was nifter, but it's been published within the last 10 years, I would say, this particular edition. Okay, so we're going to go through the first chapter rapid fire as a form of review. Okay, so let's go to chapter 1. Okay, Chiyuv Hashavas Aveda, the obligation of returning lost items. Chiyuv HaHashava, Haroeh Avedat Yisrael, if a person sees something that was lost by a Jew, and remember we said you have to determine whether it was lost by a Jew or not based on the population where you find it, Sheyesh Ba Siman, and it has a siman, Umalim Einov Mimena, and if a person hides his eyes from it, which means he ignores it, Over Below Tase, he violates a negative commandment, Shenemar Lo Sira Shorachicha Oetzion Nidachim V'Hisalamta Mehem, Lo Tuchali Hitale. You may not see the ox of your brother or his sheep stranded and wandering and hide from it or ignore it. You do not have a right to ignore. So you've violated a negative commandment, ubitul mitzvahs aseh, shenemar hashev tishivein leachicha, and you also have squandered a positive commandment, which is you shall surely return it to your brother. Yesh omrim sheberoa velo magbia over al haaseh va'al halot haaseh, v'yesh omrim sheberiya over al halot haaseh va'al haaseh eno over elim keinot labiyada. So there's a dispute which we didn't crystallize carefully when we first learned it in the Rav Shulchan Aruch. Some say that if you ignore it and just walk past it, you violate both the positive and the negative. And some say that you only violate the negative and you're only in violation of the positive if you actually pick it up and keep it for yourself. Okay, next, not lola atzmo, if you pick it up for yourself. Higbiya ha'aveda al das lekachta le'atzmo o le'ovda biyadayim over gam alav shalo tigzol. If you pick up a lost item and you keep it for yourself, or you pick it up in order so that you can destroy it, or let's say you step on it, or any other kind of destructive act, you violate an additional mitzvah lo saseh of thou shalt not steal, because it is considered to be someone else's property. Chazar bo v'heshiv ha'aveda leba'olim kodem shehitiya'ashu tiken et kol ha'isurim sha'avar. If, however, you return it like you had originally picked it up with malicious intent, and then you had a change of heart, like we learned this in the Rav Shulchan Aruch, and you return it before the owner has given up hope of retrieval, so you've rectified all of the bad that you had committed. V'gam ki mitzvahs aseh shel v'heshiv hagzeila milvad hamitzvahs aseh shel hashev teshivei. You've also fulfilled the positive commandment to return the stolen item that was stolen, in addition to return a lost object. Chayiv lahachzir gam la'achar yeyush haba'olim, but you're still obligated if you picked it up before the owner had yeyush and then you kept it with you until they were miyayish, so then you still have an obligation to return it. V'yesh omrim shetikin bekachet halav shel lo tigzol, v'kei mitzvah saseh shel v'heshev v'sagzela, u'mitzvah saseh shel hashef teshivim, aches halav shel lo tuchal lihitalem lo tikein. But basically, he's just running through which mitzvahs you did fulfill and which mitzvahs you did not fulfill. If you only returned it after the guy was miyayish, you did not fulfill. You rectified everything, but the only thing you didn't rectify was you may not hide from it. Okay, we'll run through this. We can continue through this. Himtin bahashava. If a person delayed returning a lost object. Higbia ta'aveda al dat lahashiva, v'himtin milahachriz ashehitiashu habe'alim. If, let's say, you lifted up an object with proper intent to return it, but then you got lazy, you procrastinated, whatever it is, and the owner in the interim gave up hope, so imlak chala atzmo overrak al mitzvahs aseh shel hashev teshive. So if you end up keeping it, so you're over on a positive commandment. Lo higbia ta'aveda ad shehitiashu habe'alim, ve'acharei shehitiashu lakcha le'atzmo, overrak al halav shelo tuchal lihitalem. So if you only picked it up, let's say you procrastinated, you left the lost object there in the field or the park or whatever it was, and you only picked it up after the owner already had yeyush, so then you kept it for yourself, and you are only in violation of the mitzvah lo saseh of lo tuchal lihitalem. So he's really at the beginning sections, he's only going through just matters of what did you violate and what didn't you violate, which is really not particularly relevant, right? As far as the practical practice. Mikan nilmad, from here we can learn shechov lihizdarez b'hachraza al mitziyah. From here we can learn from all of the aforementioned that it's very important to pick it up quickly and to take action quickly to announce it. Because if you procrastinate, then it's altogether possible that in the interim, between the time you picked it up and the time you are ready to make the announcement, the owner has given up hope. And therefore, if in the end you end up keeping it, you would be over on a mitzvah saseh. Okay, Daled. Ra'a aveda v'lo higbia v'yesh b'simonim afal pisha over al ha'aseh v'halot taseh hanizcharim b'sif aleph mikol makom im avda patr mitashlumeha. If you saw a lost object and you squandered the opportunity to do hashavas aved and you just left it there, it's true that you were over on a mitzvah aseh. However, no one can sue you for not being a good Samaritan. In other words, no one can take you to Beis Din and say, hey, you saw my lost object, you didn't pick it up, you have to pay me. A person cannot be sued and be chayiv to pay for his inaction. However, you did squander a mitzvah, and you're in violation of not doing the mitzvah of hashavas aveda. Next, ein ba siman im chayiv lahagbia. Do you have to pick up an object that doesn't have a siman? Aveda she'ein ba siman l'rov haposkim poter milahagbia. So we say, he says, according to most poskim, you do not even have to pick up an object that doesn't have a siman. Ach imatza b'makom she'talmidei chachamim mitzuim shechom lahakir b'tvias ayin yagbia. But the exception would be if you find it in a place where there are talmidei chachamim present. Like we learned in the Rav Shulchan Aruch, let's say you find it in a Beit Midrash or you find it in a shul, so then it's prudent to pick it up. Why? Because even something that doesn't have a siman might be identifiable by a Talmid Chacham who we know do not say mistruths, right? Remember we learned that whole section about when do Talmidei Chachamim lie, when do they not lie. And if someone is limited in the times that they lie only for the sake of shalom, then you can trust the person when he says, yes, I recognize it. That spoon that you found is mine. Okay, next. And by the way, he hasn't defined He has a section to define what is called the siman, and we're going to see that in the Rav Shulchan Aruch as well. Ein habe'alim mechapsim acharei avedatam. So he writes that this obligation is even when the owner is not looking for their lost object. In Vav he writes, Chovat ha'hashava hi gam kishein habalam mechapsim achareha ba'af im mivutachat b'chevrat bituach. He says that this obligation is even when the owner is not actively looking for the lost object. There is still a mitzvah for a person to return the lost object. And that's true even if you put it in the lost and found. There's still an obligation. You can't exempt yourself by saying, well, I brought it to the lost and found, and I can just forget about it. There is still an obligation to try and actively seek out the owner. Okay, next, the value. You're not obligated to return a lost item that is worth less than a shava pruta, meaning that if it has negligible value, then you don't have to return it. And it's sometimes difficult to determine whether something has negligible value or not. And he says like this, Erech shava pruta misharm lefiha ba'olim v'lo lefiha motze. It would have to be evaluated based upon the relationship of the object to the owner, not the relationship of the object to the finder. So let's say the finder is a very wealthy person and he finds a spoon and he says to himself, I couldn't care less if I lost the spoon, I can always get a replacement. That's not a fair assessment to say that I'm patur from the mitzvah, because maybe the person who lost it is a poor person, and that person may find that the loss of the spoon is extremely difficult for them. Kigon hamotze na'al bodedes, or adasha shel mishkafayim otumuna mishpachtit. So he gives us certain examples. He says, let's say you find a single shoe, which really has no value, because when you find a single shoe, you can't do anything with it. Or let's say adasha shel mishkafayim, which I'm not sure what the word adasha means over here. Let me just look it up quickly, unless someone knows already what that means. It means a lens. Sorry. Let's say you find the lens of a pair of glasses, which again you can't do anything with because it's got a very specific prescription, and it's not of any value to the finder. Otumuna mishpachtit, or let's say you find a photo, and it's a family photo, or it's an old photo of someone who you don't recognize, and therefore it has no value to you. Shulamotzi eino shava pruta. So for the person who lost it, or the person who finds it rather, it has absolutely no value. V'la me'abeder karav chayiv b'hashava. But for the person who lost it, it has great value. So therefore you still have the mitzvah of hashava saveda. Ve'ein lismoch al kach sha'acherem lo yigu ba'aveda machmat she'eino shava be'eineihem. And you also can't say, well, I'll just leave it where it is, because since no one would want this, it'll stay where it is and no one else will pick it up, and let the person who lost it retrace their steps and find it. That would not be a legitimate thing to do if you can tell that it's lost in an area where it fell from a person's pocket. Okay, now next halacha. If you find it in a place which is shamur, which is a protected or guarded area, hamotze aveda b'makom shamur, kagon shemuchba'at b'toch tzemacheha sevucha o b'tochur b'kotel. Let's say you find a lost object in a place where it seems to be protected from sight. Let's say it's hidden in a flower bed, or let's say it's placed in the wall, in a hole in a wall, ba'ashpa she'ein asuya lepinoi, or a garbage heap, b'toch aron telephone o chashmal, or let's say you find it in a telephone booth. You see an object that was placed there, or an electric box. So im nira shehunach sham bekavana. Let's say if it seems like it was placed deliberately there, va'afilu im safek hadavar, asur liga af kashiyesh basim. Then, since it was hidden, let's say, even though it's a public area, let's say you're walking past an electric box in your apartment building, on the outside of your apartment building, and then you happen to see behind the door, which is cracked open just slightly, you happen to see an object of value. He says, since it seems that it was probably placed there deliberately by the person who owns it, it's usher for you to touch it, even if it has a siman. But usher shelo kedin v'natal ha'aveda hanal, and if you violated the halacha and you ended up taking it, im kvar lakcha lebeso usher l'lachzir l'makoma elam yesh ba siman yachriz. So if you've already spent all that time to take it home to your house, so then you have to be concerned that maybe the person who put it there in the interim went back to his hiding space and saw that it was gone. So therefore, by you bringing it back is insufficient, because then the person will have had yeyush. So therefore, you have to do hashavas aveda. And if it doesn't have a siman, you have to keep it until Eliyahu Hanavi comes. And like we saw from Rav Moshe, and he actually is the source. He quotes that source as well. You're allowed to eventually sell it as long as you mark down its value, you have it properly valuated. Okay. He says, if, however, you just picked it up, but you haven't yet schlepped it back to your house, so there's not been a significant time lag, so then you can, if you realize what you did was wrong, you can just then put it back in the hiding place and cover it up again. And then he says, if you look at my footnote, right, he says in the footnote, but that's only if it doesn't have any signs of having been there for an extended period of time. But if it has signs, let's say it's collected dust or rust, like we learned before, then the question is, did the owner have yeyush? And if you can make a proper estimation, if it's reasonable to assume that the owner had yeyush, so then in many instances you can just keep it for yourself. Okay, so that's when it's put in a hiding place. But let's say the next scenario, which we also saw, if it's put in a place which is only partially guarded or partially hidden. So matza aveda b'makom hashomer k'tzas kegon me'achori gidros habatim. So let's say you find it in a place that's only partially protected. So let's say it's behind the fence, b'pinasha beginat misachakim, or if it's in the corner of a park. Beinim nera shehunach sham bekavana uveinim nera shenishkach sham. He says it does, regardless of whether it was looks like it was deliberately put down there, or whether it was forgotten there. Af b'yesh bo simin, even when it has a simin, imhu mechafatzim v'chutei erech kugon kipa garav chalak b'mischak yiladim. He says if it's an object that has very little value, like a kippah or a sock or a chelak mimischak yiladim, or a part from a child's toy, v'nira shekeshiyachriz lo yavo habolom lakachat avedatam, and it seems to you clear that even if you were to announce it, the owner would not come forward because the owner would assign it to have negligible value. And based on also the fact that it has minimal value, probably no one else is going to take it. So by you leaving there, the owner will come back to get it. Lo yigabo, then you shouldn't touch it. And he says, see my footnote. So this is a slightly different formulation of the issue, but this is really where it gets to the very practical halachic issue. You're walking through York Hill Park on Shabbos, okay? And you see a kippah, or you see a baseball cap, right? So in those scenarios, the object has negligible value to the point where even if you do make an announcement, it's unlikely that someone is going to say, look at the sign that you put up in the shul and say, oh, that baseball cap belongs to my son. Now, obviously, it will depend on the value of the object to the person who lost it. So I remember Alan Mall had asked the question of, let's say, a baseball cap for the Blue Jays, right? So that probably would have negligible value. But let's say it's a real collector's item. Let's say it was signed by, I don't know who plays for the Blue Jays, that you would have really significant value. So then there are certain circumstances where you would have to, it depends on how you assess the value of the object that's lost. Achim hu yakar erech im ein bo simen lo yigabo v'im yesh bo simen yochel yitol v'yachers. So therefore, if it has significant value, so if there's no siman on it, because let's say it's something that's totally nondescript, so then you shouldn't touch it, because it's unclear whether it was left there deliberately or not. But if it has the siman, then you would be obligated to pick it up and to do hashavas aveda. Okay, now, avar v'natal b'makom shenifsak shelo yigabo, afilu lo halach adayin leveso asur lahachzir. Now, if anytime you violate the halacha and you pick up something that we said you're not supposed to touch, so then you are not allowed to just put it back. The exception being if it was put in a hiding place. So we said if it was put in a clear hiding place and you haven't had a sufficient amount of time from the time that you took it, so then you just put it back. But here we're talking about in places where you find it which are not sufficiently protected, you can't, if you picked it up when you weren't supposed to, it's not enough just to put it back. Vim ein basimin yesh omim sharei shalo, kifi hapratim shenichtov lahalan beperak sif dalad ayin sham, v'yesh omim she'anichad sheyavo Eliyahu. So, and there's a machlokus in the poskim whether if it doesn't have a siman, can you just outright keep it, or do you have to leave it until Eliyahu Navi, meaning that you have to sort of mark it down and assess its value. Okay, and then finally, the last part of the chapter is Avedat Tov, Avedat Chavero. Let's say you have a conflict and you have to deal with either your lost object or your friend's lost object. Matza Aveda Shalo V'Shel Chavero. Let's say you find a lost object that belongs to your friend, and you find your own lost object. V'Yachol Lahachzir Rak Echad Mehem, and you can only return one of them. So what do we mean by that? Let's say your animal strayed out of your corral, and while you're working on retrieving your animal, you see your friend's animal, which is also straying, and each one of them has a collar which clearly identifies whose animal it is. Okay, and you only have the koyach. Let's say they're both cows, and you're working on the plantation or the farm. You only have the wherewithal to return one animal. You can't return both because they're too bulky. So the halacha is that your friend's lost object takes priority to even your own lost object, and you would have to forfeit retrieving your own animal for the sake of retrieving your friend's animal. I'm sorry, avedaso kodemis, your own lost object comes first. You have a right to say, my lost object takes priority over my friend's lost objects. So in other words, you're not obligated to impoverish yourself in order to save your friend's asset. And even if your friend tells you, he says, please grab my cow and let your cow go and I'll pay you for your cow, you have a right to refuse, because you could always say, I'd rather have the cow than the cash. Amnam, yesh lo la'adam lasos lifnim mishuras hadin, v'lo ledaktek v'lo mar shalikodim. But with all of that said, the poskim still write that it's virtuous to go beyond the letter of the law and not to say that, my stuff takes priority. Imlo behefsed hamuchach, unless it's really significant financial loss. Ve'imedaktek tamid porek mimenu ol gemilos chasodim v'sofu sheitzdarech labrios. And if you make a habit of always placing your own stuff, your own financial possessions before putting your friend's possessions, giving priority to your friend's possessions, so then eventually you'll eventually be financially dependent upon others because you haven't taken his lost items to heart. You have, in other words, don't make it a habit. If it's a one-time thing where your cow and his cow, you have a right to take your cow home. But if this regularly happens and you regularly neglect someone else's lost items for the sake of preserving your own assets, so then Hashem will take this to heart and will cause you to lose your assets. And then next one is Avedas Aviv, Avedas Rabba. What if you have a conflict between your lost object, or sorry, your father's lost object and your Rebbe's lost object? So this is obviously like something that's brought down in the Gemara in Bava Metzia, that if you have the opportunity to retrieve a lost object for your father or for your Rebbe, whose is more important? Matza Avedas Aviv, Avedas Rabbo. V'yachol lahachzir rak echad mehem, im aviv shakol keneged rabo machzir shel aviv. If your father is as important as your Rebbe, meaning that your father has taught you a tremendous amount, just like your Rebbe has, so then you return your father's lost object, because he's both your father and your teacher. But ach imhu rabo hamuvhak, sherov chachmas lamad mimenu v'gam hu gadol me'aviv v'chol ma shelimdo b'chinam rabo kodem. But if your father taught you very little, and most of your teaching, your Torah education came from this Rebbe, and this is a very distinguished person who has more stature than your father, and all that you learned from your Rebbe, he taught you for free, meaning that he is just the person who you look up to as a father figure, because you've gained most of your Torah learning from that person. So then your Rebbe's lost object comes first. In other words, in most situations, since a father pays for your tuition and raises you and all of that stuff, so your father's lost object comes first. But if a father was really not an active father, he was an absentee father, and your Rebbe really taught you most of your Torah, so then your Rebbe would take priority. And the last thing that we'll do for today is Kimli Ba'aveda. He says, as a general rule, Aveda shenechlugu ba haposkim im chayv la'agbia v'higbia. Whenever there's a machlokes as to whether you're supposed to lift up an object to return it, and you went ahead and indiscriminately you either forgot the halacha or you decided you would just pick it up without checking. A person can't say, well, I paskin like a certain authority that allows me to put it back and then just put it back. He says, whenever there's a controversy as far as whether you're allowed to put something back or not, you have to be machmir. Similarly, anytime where there's a machlokes as to whether you are chayiv or not in hashavas aveda, in this particular instance, you should always be machmir, because remember, we're dealing with a mitzvah de oraisa, and so suffik de oraisa is lechumra. So if there's a machlokes in the poskin as to whether you should return something or not, you always should be machmir and do the and go like the more stringent authority. And that concludes the full first chapter of this review. And chapter 2 is, when are you exempt from hashavas aveda? And maybe we'll do this tomorrow. Okay. Any questions? Comments? All right. It's good to see you all. Shavua Tov.